her book, How Infants Know Minds, won the British Society for Psychology Book Award. In my opinion, they did well to pick it. It's wonderful. And I was going to tell you that she's one of the Templeton Grant winners, except when you look at her history of grants, you can see that we're actually really kind of insignificant on her record. The grant that she just finished before she took our grant she just finished was a grant for $700,000. So Vasu has been very much a presence in this field. She's done marvelous things, particularly in this area. It's my pleasure now to introduce her for this afternoon's talk.
Thank you, Eleanor. I think I'm going to start in response to you, as I mean to go on in relation to what I'm talking about, which is that it's quality, not quantity, that counts. Yeah, that's great. Okay, this is a kind of odd title, and it was the trouble with talks that are planned a long time in advance is that you have to invent a title, and then you have to live up to it. So, but there is a reason for this particular idea of talking about attraction. Okay, I think that the sort of central point I'm going to make is like it's very, very close to what Peter, the emphasis that Peter has had not only in his talk today but in his work throughout, and it's wonderfully touching in many points, like in terms of the realism, for instance, and in terms of the grounding in common engagement, the stuff that Naomi was talking about. So it kind of makes a really interesting whole as a package, which I hadn't quite seen before. All right. For an audience like this, I don't think I really need to go into much detail about my perception of psychology's approach to other minds. So I'm going to kind of be a bit brief about it. The sort of central point I want to make is that there's been generally a neglect of emotional connection. Even now, when you talk about emotion is okay within psychology, but emotional connection, gosh, what are you talking about? And when you talk about emotion as well, it's often seen as a very, very individual process. When you're talking about other minds, emotion doesn't really come into the picture, into discussions. It is usually seen as a kind of a thought-based, reflective process that we need to understand. And it is indeed a desperately intellectual process. Desperately, I use the word deliberately, partly because even when people try to avoid the very conscious, reflective-based, deductive kind of approach, which focuses on theoretical processes like in the theory of mind, even approaches within psychology who try to avoid the sort of intellectualism and internalism of that kind of approach still avoid talking about emotion. So, I mean, I was thinking, for example, of dynamic systems theory or dynamic systems approaches, which in general are great. And I mean, they really kind of capture the situatedness of stuff rather than locating everything inside the individual. And yet, there's something kind of, in my view, missing, because it's really very hard within those systems approaches not to talk about emotions as being not inside, as being not subjective. I don't mean emotions are only inside, and I do mean emotions are shared and can be around in shared atmosphere. But if you aren't talking about subjective experience at all, if you're deliberately avoiding that because it's uncomfortable, there is something that's going wrong with the way in which we're approaching the idea of other minds. Another good example of within the infancy literature, I don't know whether you know this stuff at all, but there's stuff about ostensive communication, Gergely, the two Hungarian guys, and Shibra, and they talk a lot about the enormous power of early mutual gaze. So they talk about like 6-month-olds, for instance, if you look at them in the eyes and then you do all sorts of complicated experiments, right, using computer displays. I mean, there was one study he showed with 7-month-olds doing a false belief task, 7 or 8 months old, which followed mutual gaze, and of course it clarified the whole world. The infants understood everything, and they succeeded in all these kind of very clever deductions about. But the way in which they talk about gaze, what does it mean? It's a cue. It's an ostensive cue. It's a cue to, oh, that person wants me to see something, focus on something. That person wants to show me something. So if you start talking about, in a non-intellectualized way, stuff about cues, it becomes very difficult to actually capture emotion. So we've got a deep difficulty in thinking about emotional processes, particularly in terms of relation, and very much in terms of in connection with talking about other minds. So I wanted to, when I wrote this book that Eleanor was talking about, I wanted to call it, so the title of the book is How Infants Know Minds. And I wanted to call it Feeling Other Minds, right? Because it seemed to me, if you're familiar with a bit of it, you will know, but if you aren't, I'm going to tell you about it. It seemed to me that it captured exactly the twist of the problem, my intention to twist the problem of other minds, from knowing to feeling. Not that they are exclusive, but that it actually shifts the emphasis, right? It was an American publisher, and I wasn't allowed to do it, not because they didn't like emotions. You know what I'm going to say, yeah? So the idea of feeling other minds was like very, very kind of, I think it was sexually laden for them. So when a few years ago, we had these kind of inaugural talks when you get, I don't know, something famous happens, or something. The university asked me to do an inaugural talk, and I thought, this is my chance. I'm going to use the title that I want. So instead of calling it Feeling Other Minds, you had to submit the title to the university. So my title was, what was it, On Feeling and Being Felt in Infancy. I don't think that's funny, okay? But needless to say, I wasn't allowed to do it. This is something that, okay, I'm going to come to this issue not as a philosopher, so I'm kind of I'm going to just go for it and just say what I have been saying and what I think. So I am probably more ignorant than I should be of a lot of philosophy of mind and background to it. But this is what my perception is of how psychology has dealt with other minds. It's been notoriously difficult within psychology to accept the thinking of mentality as anything other than opaque and hard to get. So there's been a tradition both from behaviorism in early to mid 20th century, which was so uncomfortable with talk of mind, which preceded that period. This is the usual Watson kind of story, that the solution was, let's focus on that which is visible. And the solution that behaviorism took to dealing with this difficulty was, let's not talk about mind at all, let's just talk about behavior. That's fine. So then in the 1960s was the cognitive revolution, and cognitivism within psychology came to the fore. And obviously, it's wrong to think that we haven't got consciousness and we can't talk about mind, because that's our everyday bread and butter. We deal with minds, for goodness sake. So cognitivism, the cognitive revolution, absolutely embraced mind. Okay? But then what it did, and this is not a point that it's only me that I'm making it, as the sociologist Jeff Coulter, for instance, makes it, my colleague Alan Costel has made this very many times, cognitivism adopted exactly the same split between mind and behavior that behaviorism did, right? Except now cognitivism said, we don't want to talk about behavior, because behavior is mere behavior, it's uninformative, because it doesn't have some kind of concordant relations with mind. So let's just talk about mind. So in the end, you end up with this kind of very weird situation where for cognitive developmental psychology to give any explanations of how some kind of cognitive advancement happens, they need a preceding phase of mere behavioral stuff happening, right? In other words, you accept the same split, and developmentally, your explanations basically say, okay, if we accept that, which we do accept the split, initially there's just stuff going on which is mere behavior. It is not directly relevant or certainly not concordant with any kind of cognitive explanation. Then, based on that, you then get conceptual advances. So you've got a kind of a conceptual split horizontally, and then you've got a developmental split kind of vertically. So the two kind of need each other in a funny way, despite their being split. Okay. It kind of intrigues me. I'm sorry for going on about that. But anyway, the stuff about if you want to actually climb into minds, you need some kind of bridge because they're hard to get. That's the basic point. And you do it through inference, you do it through concepts, you do it through schemas or imagination or something, but you need a bridge. There's a problem there and you need to cross it. So there's been a kind of because of this separation of the cognitive, this extreme valuing of conceptual, reflective roots to other minds, there's been a kind of a huge neglect of what happens before in this mere behavior phase, in this interaction which you can call, oh, that's just emotional, or that's just social. I mean, these are not terms I'm even inventing. I've even heard people using these terms, partly because you don't know what to make of that stuff that happens very early, okay? So, all right, for whatever reason, this early stuff gets very, very neglected. The problem is the very phenomena, from a developmental point of view, that can explain how thought happens, or how concepts develop, or how more sophisticated understandings develop, are ruled out. Because they might look sophisticated, but it's just behavior. We don't want them. We don't want to actually focus on them. They're kind of ruled out. So you then get a very crazy kind of set up with top-down explanations where, because you're dealing with certain phenomena, conceptually, the concept that you are using to say this is what understanding belief means, or this is what having a self means, or this is what self-other differentiation means, it arrives conceptually, you set it up as criteria, and everything that happens before becomes labeled a pseudo-phenomenon. Okay? So, okay, this is a bit of a long-winded introduction to tell you why it is really important to look early. And perhaps for an audience like this, it's not strictly necessary. Let me go back to another thing, another attempt to bridge this so-called gap between self and other, or between one mind and another. And this doesn't use concept, theory, schema, or imagination. Generally, this is the kind of usually the neurological bridge. I mean, Eleanor talked about it earlier, but I think you use the term like me in a slightly different way. I think you're using the term like me in the sense that there is something about seeing others as persons like me, which is important. Well, the like me as a term within developmental psychology is being used all over the place, even now. And the argument is basically that there is some kind of something in your body, the similarity of your body to another person's body, where you can perceive the similarities of movement, of action, of motor potential, that allows you to say, aha, that's a being like me, and therefore I need to pay attention, I need to understand, or I can understand. And the bridge, the connection, might be motoric in terms of perceived motor actions, or it might be neurological. So this whole mirror system argument, that you actually understand what an action means because you can do it. Your perception of an action is interpreted in terms of your capacity to do that action yourself, which may, I'm not kind of trying to exclude the importance of similarity for some aspects to spur development on, or to spur understanding on. But I don't actually think, two things. One is, I don't think the mirror system kind of arguments or recognitions of similarity explain the why of development, or the why of engagement, rather. I think a neurological bridge between your brain and another brain might explain how it is, for example, that you might start to engage with a person in a way that you don't start to engage with a table. But it doesn't actually explain why do you bother doing it. And I think that's one big reason why we need something else. The something else that I would suggest is something like within the second person kind of approach. So what's the problem? I think life and experience is rather richer than connecting with others because we see similarity. Okay? One, I think it doesn't explain the why. The other, I think reality is a bit more complex than that. It's a bit richer than that. We don't just engage with the similar. One of the things that I think could work well towards explaining the why, and something about the richness and the potential for openness of our engagement, is responding to things that attract you. Is responding, in fact, to difference, but difference which you feel as attractive. Okay? So Okay, I'll give you an example of, I mean, I don't know actually, it's one of the things I was thinking about. No, okay. Well, I was just thinking, I had this thought about, while you were talking or someone was talking, I was thinking it would be really nice, and maybe I'll do it, is do a study of moments which open doors intellectually. I mean, it's particularly interesting in terms of humility or in terms of the movement of ideas, but in lots of moments which actually change your perception of your theory, of your data, and move your thinking forward. Anyway, that was the kind of slightly digressing idea, but the event that I'm kind of trying to discuss, I was listening to a Greek compilation CD made by a friend of a friend, and which was sent. So it was all in Greek. I didn't understand a word. But one part of it was not, so it was not all songs. One part of it was poetry being read by this guy Hadzidakis, who's this composer, poet kind of guy. And it was okay, it was a very, very deep and I suppose sexy voice in a way you could say, but it was like, it was a powerful voice. I mean, it was like you couldn't help kind of getting just sucked into the sound of the voice. And as he spoke, and I didn't understand a word, and this was going on in the background while I was doing something in the kitchen, but this voice was speaking, and it was really like this powerful experience of being called by it, of being drawn into it, right? And it was just beautiful, and I didn't understand it. And for me, the interesting thing was what the emotion it evoked in me. It was attractive, but the emotion it evoked in me was that I wanted to understand. There were sort of sounds here and there which I could vaguely make sense of, which kind of connected with something I'd heard before. And there was all sorts of things. There was meanings in his voice. There was intonations there. And I kind of wanted to know what he meant and wanted to join in, if you like, into that language group. And for me, okay, it's a metaphor. But in a sense, if you think about the world of infants, okay, there are some similarities between their bodies and others, but the powerful thing is that there are all these beings around, some of whom have facial features, voice sounds, smells, body warmth, which are attractive. But they're also doing all these complex things that are kind of, I think that is the motivation you want. The motivation is, I'm attracted, I like you, but I want to understand you. So if you really want a simple metaphor for why do we even bother to develop, that has got to be a little bit closer to it than you're like me, so I want to engage with you. Okay? So I've been kind of very influenced by the very little I know, bits I've read of Martin Buber, for instance, and a very, very little bit of Gadamer. I've been kind of trying to read a bit about him recently, but bloody hell. I think I'm kind of very content with reading third-hand, second-hand versions of him. I can understand those. But the thing about their approach, anyway, is that there's something about direct second-person engagements which are vivid, often irresistible, and don't allow you to not respond. So if I come up and look deeply into your eyes, you could be really pissed off with me, but even if you deliberately keep your entire expression straight and do nothing, you're not doing nothing. You're doing, it's almost like it doesn't leave you room for nothing. And the other thing it seems to suggest is that if you are the kind of being where particular approaches from the world, and it doesn't even particularly have to be from people like you, if particular approaches from the world grab you, engage you, engagements are transformative. So that's a kind of assumption I'm making. It's a kind of claim that I'd like to make. I don't really have enough data to support it, except there was even today, there was all sorts of bits about, in Naomi's and in Peter's talk, of examples where maybe there is data around about the transformative power of engagements. Okay, so infancy and the second person. Do we have evidence that in typical development, this is the way in fact it works? That it gives us answers to how and why we understand other approaches, like, what was that beer? Was it Heineken? Refreshes the parts that other beers cannot reach? Well, that's the second person approach for you. So most standard approaches in understanding others within developmental psychology use definitely use third-person methods. They treat infants as spectators, and the infant's behavior is interpreted through third-person theories. And basically what I mean through infant as spectators, almost all most of the studies that we do of infants, not all, but most of them, generally have, and the younger they get, the more we do it, we treat infants as spectators. So you put them in that chair, you make them comfortable, sometimes you put them on the mother's lap, but you show them videos. And you show them videos of A relating to B, or A relating to B via C, and so on and so forth. And what you're doing is using subtle measures, and we've made huge advances despite this, in a sense. The reason it's a problem is because infants' experiences of the world are not primarily as spectators, neither are ours. Infants' experiences of the world are as participants. They're not just observers of the world. They are also observers, but they're also most saliently participants in the world. So despite that, despite the fact that spectator methods could be problematic, we have learned a lot, but they're not enough. Let me take as an example something that partly is the title of one title of this conference, and partly is something that both Peter and Naomi have focused on. This idea of infants' understanding of attention. Standard approaches, so the way in which I'm going to tackle this idea of attention now is coming at it from a slightly different, it's not contradictory in any way to what Peter and Naomi have said, but it's coming at it from a slightly different angle. So I'm not talking about what are the criteria needed for understanding joint attention, what's actually going on in adulthood, how do we ground that concept in ordinary interaction. What I'm talking about is how do we get there? Okay, so the standard approach, in other words, the developmental process, primarily within the first year, primarily within the first 9 months, before which we supposedly have no consciousness of other people's attention as attention. That is the claim. That's the bit that I'm going to kind of focus on. So the standard claim is this. It kind of began in the 1970s with Elizabeth Bates and her. They did this amazingly wonderful naturalistic study within a Piagetian kind of framework, and basically going from the idea that somewhere around the end of the first year, 11 months-ish, 10, 11 months-ish, maybe 12 months-ish, infants discover tools. They discover means and ends. They can use one thing to get another. So I can pull your, not belt, I'm not going to say that because that reminds me of the story. I can pull a cord that is tied to you to pull you closer to me, where the cord would be the tool, the means, and you would be the end. Or I can do it, I mean, the simplest test actually is to have a tablecloth with a toy on it which is too far, and you see whether the infant reaches by pulling the cloth. Okay? In other words, using a means to another end. Now that separation of means and ends is believed, and is probably true, more or less, not to happen until quite late in the first year. Okay? So what's this got to do with other minds? Well, Elizabeth Bates and her colleagues discovered that there are two kinds of phenomena that happen somewhere towards the end of the first year, after 11 months-ish. And this is to do with pointing. Kids start to point. And it can be in some kids dramatic, in some kids rather slowly developing when they start to point. So they start to point at things out there. And it's like, it's a vivid action. And especially if you've got only one baby in the house, and all you've got to do is sort of look adoringly and wonderingly at how clever they are. This is an amazing gesture. So what are they doing? They're doing that thing, right? So it's a kind of what they called a proto-imperative point. So it's an imperative as in a command, it's a proto because it's not quite linguistic, and what they want is, I'm using my point, my action, to a person to get an object, right? So my action, I'm using my action, but I'm using the person, in Bates's terminology, as a tool to get, as a means to get the end, which is the object. But I also do it in a different way, right? So I can point to that clock and say, okay? So here what I'm doing is I'm using the object as the means to get your attention. So this is how that kind of thinking began about this triadic joint attention and what it means in terms of understanding minds in this pretty much the current terminology. So what they said, and what other people have echoed since is that somewhere around that period, between 9 and 12 months, something like that, what Trevarson calls the period of secondary intersubjectivity and so on and so forth, somewhere around then, infants discover other people, they discover attention. So because I discover that you have attention inside you, I can use the object to get that attention, or I can use your attention to get the object. So, okay? What happened? Why does this happen around then? Because suddenly into this nice warm mother-infant dyad enters what they call the third element. The third element is this flying object from outside, which comes into the dyad, which allows the dyad to expand and therefore engage in the kinds of interactions which reveal means-ends understanding and which reveal the infant's discovery, or no, which create the infant's discovery of other minds, other attention. Okay? Kind of long-winded, sorry about that, but that was kind of the background. So this is the standard story, and it's kind of important to see. It is not a standard story that has gone out of fashion. I would say that even now, if you ask people, when do infants understand other people's attentionality or attending? Do they understand that somebody is looking? When do they understand that somebody else is aware attentionally of something? The answer is going to be somewhere towards the end of the first year, somewhere after 9 months. That is still very much a standard story. Now, the alternative story comes from the question, well, what the hell has been happening in the first 9 months? Attention hasn't been people's attendingness, lookingness, awareness, visual, tactile engagement, responses to what you're looking at, their sudden, starts in terms of their attentionality in the world. That has not been missing from the child's experience. So what is the infant actually making of it? Nothing at all, or what, in terms of awareness? The argument that I'm going to try and have been trying to make is that it's the infants, the reason, quite in contrast to the idea that it is somewhere towards the end of the first year that the infant discovers attention. My argument is that it is because infants, like anybody else, feel something when other people attend to them, right? It is because they feel something when they receive attention directed to them that they can understand attention in increasingly complicated ways with development. If you didn't feel, if I looked at you and smiled at you and you felt nothing at all, I wouldn't talk to you, but hey, if for you receiving somebody else's mind in some way directed to you was kind of meaningless, if it did not arouse emotional response in you, if it did not invite you to respond, to engage, or it didn't get you to feel anything different from just watching, I don't know, somebody looking at somebody else on the screen. Yes, it would limit your engagement with that person and with that mind in the future, but it would also, the meaning that you would have, the understanding that you would have of what's called looking behavior, or gaze if you like, or touching, or intentionality, or whatever it is, the meaning that you have of mind would be different. You would still have a mind. If, as you came down from Mars, as Peter was saying, and you watched people looking, smiling, touching, kissing, hugging, whatever, right? Reaching, poking, and you could see it, right? It didn't have that same impact on you because you were biologically different, or because, for whatever reason, your composition could not relate to that. If that were the case, you would still be able to extract patterns of attention, right? But your understanding at any point in development, or what does attention mean, is going to be a kind of a rather more detached, rather more third-person kind of view of, attention is when people look and then they startle and then they do this and then they move on and then such and such happens. It cannot but be that way. That your concept of attention, our concept of anything, has to come from our experience of that thing. Now, our experience of that thing can come from reading other people's versions of it, So I could be a Martian who understands Earth and understand what Earthlings say about attention, so I could get at it indirectly. But even so, but my experience would be missing from it. But if I did not have the experience of the emotionality of engaging with minds, I could not have a concept of mind in the typical way. Okay? So again, completely in contrast to the idea that some kind of conceptual advances allow us to discover mind, my argument is that minds are grasped through the response that you have to them within engagement. Okay? Okay. Gosh. Right. So now I'm going to kind of start talking about some data and some studies we have done. A couple of things. One is there's been some really, really remarkable studies done by Amanda Woodward and her colleagues, I think Chicago somewhere. I don't know where she is actually. Looking at very infants, again, third person, watching videos and detecting them, understanding of responses to surprise by different kinds of intentional actions done by other people. Okay? Now, Amanda Woodward made one point about how does perceiving somebody else's intentional actions and understanding them, to whatever limited extent, differ from understanding attention. So she says, if you are a baby of 5 months and you watch me reach out for this kneecap and pick it up repeatedly, that's a bit gruesome, you can see the connection between my reaching hand and that object there. But so in intentional actions, the connection between the movement, the person, and the object that they're interested in is obvious. It's tangible. It's actually physical. You can see it. In attention, her argument was, you can't see this. There is no tangible connection. I look somewhere. There is a line of sight. But for you to understand the connection between my line of sight and that object, you really have to understand sight. You really have to understand line of sight. So it's kind of, that's why she says you don't discover attention until rather later in the first year. Intentional actions, you can perceive the connection between the object and the intention very early. Attention is kind of more hard. Now, here's the thing. What does it mean to be an object of somebody's attention? Well, that clock is an object of my attention. That laptop is. You are. My thought about reception and wine at 6 o'clock is an object of attention. Of the future, my memory for last night's amazing dinner is another object of mine. There's all sorts of objects that go on in my attention, right? So for you to understand the objects of my attention, yes, you can't see any of them. You can't see the connection between any of these. But if I look at you, right, and if you indeed do have an emotional response to my attention towards you, you don't have to imagine the connection between my attention and its object. You feel it. You experience the connection. So when we talk about objects of attention and understanding the link between the attender and the object, and saying, oh, it's a bit of a difficult link to imagine, that's why it takes time, well, it depends on what the object is. If the object is the infant, the experiencer, then the connection does not have to be distally perceived, it is experienced. So it's one way of actually then beginning to understand how we might re-explain the emerging awareness of attention would be to redefine what we mean by objects of attention. Okay, I'm going to show you this one first because, so this is kind of what I've done as an alternative, right? If you look at the standard story, it is somewhere towards the end of the first year that infants discover attention. How do you know it? Because you can see this triadic, what is always call joint attention, this triadic connection between infant, other, and object. So there, in this particular case, the attentional object, somebody else's attentional object, is somewhere out in space. Okay? But before that, my point is that right from the start, the infant herself is the object of somebody else's attention and has slowly begun to feel things and understand more complexities about attention coming from within the engagement with the other. So if you had to have a different kind of objects list in developmental time, one possibility is that you start with the self as the object of someone else's attention. You have your own body, your toes, your tummy, your nappy, your bottom, which I'm not even going to go into the conversation I just had about bottoms with Naomi. Your acts, the things that you do, could also be objects of somebody else's attention. Why are you scratching your head? Or don't pull at your collar. I mean, those are actions which, if you're the infant, I could be attending to, and you need to be aware of them. Not just that I'm looking at you, but I'm looking at the stuff you're doing before you get to things in space, and after which you can get into things in time. Now, here's it's a 2.5-month-old baby, and there's 2 points of significance to it. One is that, okay, what's going to happen in the video is that the mother is carrying the baby and the baby is looking in the mirror. The baby and the mother are both looking in the mirror. You will see that when the baby's eyes come to about here, trust me on the sort of the topography of this, that's when the baby's eyes meet herself in the mirror, okay? And she smiles and she looks coy. So basically the coy thing is somebody, I don't know, somebody, handsome person of the appropriate sex meets you in the lift and says, ooh, you've got beautiful eyes. What do? You kind of like, you're not afraid of it, you like it, it's kind of nice, you find this person attractive, but it's almost impossible not to briefly gaze over it, right? So you smile, and within the big peak of your smile, you kind of slightly look away and look back, and then you say, oh, thank you, or something. It's a very, very typical common reaction. Kids are not supposed to be able to do that until somewhere in the second year, because the argument is, if you're going to look a little bit like embarrassed by something that happens, somebody else is looking at you, then you must know that you're being looked at, okay? So if you've got this kind of very cognitive model of how do you become self-conscious, then, which I will go on to a little bit more as well, then until you've got a kind of concept that you can be an object of somebody's attention, until you've got a concept of self, how do you then feel self-conscious? There's kind of a standard model about this, which I would say probably isn't talked about that much anymore, but it has held sway for a long time. You're not supposed to be able to do this until you pass that mirror self-recognition test. You know that one? The dot thing. Okay, so there's 2 reasons why I want you to look at this. One is simply the emotionality, whatever the emotion is, that can come from, in this particular case, of the baby looking at her own eyes, of meeting her own eyes. But it happens with familiar people at that age, anyone. And that's one reason. The other reason is it's very, very close to that family of emotions called embarrassment, which is not supposed to happen at this age. Okay. So, development goes on, right? So that's the kind of emotion. You can get very positive reactions to attention. You can get negative. You can get ambivalent ones like this. You can get indifferent responses to other people's reactions, you know, which parents sometimes do experience. You're trying to show off your baby and the baby's just not interested and just avoids, right? It's kind of like terribly, terribly dispiriting, but hey. So what does this mean about awareness of attention, to sum up this kind of approach that I'm kind of talking about? Well, Merleau-Ponty has this amazing quote. I discover vision, he says, not as a thinking about seeing, to use Descartes' expression, but as a gaze at grips with a visible world. And that is why, for me, there can be another's gaze. So in other words, this was the kind of example that Naomi was talking about seeing frustration of somebody looking for something, that person's attention, the whole body, is attending to something and moving around and not stopping until suddenly it bumps into the object it was looking for, and then it stops. And you can kind of see that person's engagement with the world. You can actually see attention in a certain way. But it's not enough, because even there you are still the spectator. So instead, my alternative adaptation of Merleau-Ponty's is just a very small adaptation. Is I discover vision not as a thinking about seeing, but as a gaze that grips with me. And that is why, for me, there can be another's gaze. So this is the point that I was making earlier. You've got to feel a response to it in order to... You've got to feel that gaze bumping into you, not just watch it. You get a different sense of what gaze, vision, etc. means otherwise. This is an interesting study that I just read recently about what does it mean to have people look at you. Well, there's been lots and lots of studies about the effects of mutual gaze. In this particular study, what they did was, this is with adults, okay? And they were asking the question, when somebody looks at you, what does it do to you? This is adults, okay? Does it actually make you more self-conscious? Not in the sense of embarrassed, but more conscious of yourself, more conscious of your body, more conscious of your reactions. So what they did was they had 3 kinds of conditions, and don't worry about the order and the stuff about it. One, they had a face with eyes looking at you. One, they had a face with eyes looking away or face turned away. One, they had just a cross on a similar background. In between these various stimuli, gaze averted or just across, they showed you emotionally arousing pictures. There is a standard, this is not porn, there is a standard set of, there's some kind of a term for it about, like pretty flowers and bunnies and gruesome blood and so on and so forth. And then what they did was they measured your skin conductance, and they also asked you, I think after each picture or at some point, to report how aroused you felt, how much it moved you, to put it in another way. Okay, so they got a rating of how much you think that picture affected you. And they got an actual physiological response of how much it did affect you, at least on that measure. And basically what they found is that in those, when they showed gaze directed towards you, when somebody looked at you, then it was followed by this other picture, your judgment about your own reactions was much more accurate. So if you look at the very bottom right-hand column here, is when there was eye contact, basically there's a really strong relationship, 0.68 in this kind of research is like an enormous relationship between that and accuracy, between the skin conductance and your rating. Yeah. So it kind of, I haven't talked about this, but this kind of seems to be doing something to your awareness of yourself. We did another study. This is moving a little bit into Peter's territory, but in the same sort of direction. Looking at preschool children with autism and how they engaged with themselves in the mirror, right? So it's not just engagement with others, but engagement with the self. Could also, if you like, be indicative of something about how much attention grabs you, how much engagement means to you, what do you do? We compared preschool children with autism with preschool children with Down syndrome and a typically developing set of toddlers. And one of the things what we found basically was that even when it was to do with attention to themselves, all the children in all the groups loved being in front of the mirror, right? So the amount of time they liked to spend in it tended to vary, but they loved the experience of the mirror. What they did in front of the mirror tended to vary. There was not that much difference between the typically developing group and the autism group in terms of how much attention they paid to themselves in the mirror. What was stuck out was the Down syndrome group, which had huge amount of interest in the face, more than the other two groups. But when they did look at themselves, the way in which they differed was what they did in relation to how they engaged with themselves. So basically, if you talk about social relating, which could involve smiling at, talking to, treating the person in the mirror as an audience, any of these kinds of things, the group with autism was tended to be much lower than the other two groups. Okay, so there's something in this idea of not being drawn into engagement, which can be seen not only in engagement with others but also in engagement with self. I'm actually completely I'm going. Um, okay, I'll just show you a couple of quick clips. This is a 5-year-old with autism who passed the mirror self-recognition test. But what he does, which you probably will see, is he loved the mirror. But what he does is use it to test reflections, both of himself, of the room. This was another very common pattern that we found, that it was interesting, but it was interesting as a kind of an experimental ground rather than just for themselves. I mean, you can see he's very happy with it. Which way his eyes are. Okay, this is a child with Down syndrome who hasn't passed the mirror self-recognition test, but the way in which he relates to himself is kind of very familiar. He goes and gets something to show himself in the mirror, or show that person in the mirror, as it were. Okay. Right, I ought to have had... okay, you remember I showed you this scheme, and I talked about somewhere before you get to understanding the strategic relation in space, there can be another kind of object, which is your own actions as objects. And one of the things that you get other people attending to your actions. In other words, you can understand, if you like, a triadic relation there, but the third element in that triad is not a thing out there, but is the stuff that you're doing. And one of the things that kids do around, I don't know, somewhere from around 7 months of age is clowning, showing off, and teasing. Okay, now this is an example. This is actually, we caught this the first time it occurred. Right, this is an 8-month-old, and basically, okay, you can't hear the sound, doesn't matter, I'll just tell you what it is. So she goes under the chair, and her mother is over there at the bottom left-hand corner, and you will see her head in a minute. So her mother we're filming an hour of interaction at a particular point during a whole study, and they were kind of playing, and the baby goes under there, and she's doing some funny movements, and the mother says, "Are you dancing?" And the baby kind of sits down, looks at the mother, and shakes her head. Now, this is really quite advanced and quite striking, and it's kind of interesting because it looks like it's picking up a gesture, a cultural gesture, right? So the mother starts laughing, right? Because she really didn't expect the baby to understand it, I don't think. So she starts laughing and she says, "Aren't you?" or something. So because she laughs at that shaking of the head, the baby then starts shaking the head, continues shaking the head, and goes on for some time after that. And it's very common, this, using the other person's response to inform, if you like, not just to perceive it in a mechanical way, this triadic relation, but to inform what am I going to do with this relation, yeah? Oops. So the mother asks, "Are you dancing? Are you dancing?" And the baby shakes her head. And the mother really laughs now and repeats the shaking of the head. So showing off can be of different kinds. You can show off by just doing silly stuff and getting any old reaction, or you can show off by doing clever stuff. In this particular study, we looked longitudinally at typically developing children, and basically what you found is that showing off in the first year, about half the sample did it, and it didn't really, there wasn't a kind of a developmental pattern with it. They were sensitive to reactions, and some did it and some didn't. Clowning increased, and in children with autism and Downs, in comparison, there was even with a very generous definition of clowning, which is, does your child ever do anything, repeat anything in order to re-elicit laughter? So it wouldn't cover the first time actions, it would cover, was that repeated ever? Okay, and basically there were because you could do very formulaic things, which was happening in the children with autism as well. Like you find one thing and then you repeat it again and again, which is rather different from what was happening in the children with Downs and what was happening in terms of the variety of variety of types of acts that you do to re-elicit laughter was very different. You also get teasing from around 9-10 months of age. One of the very common kinds of teasing is offer and withdrawal of objects, which is when I first noticed it. Actually, this was another one of those things I filmed by accident because I was trying to make a film of a mealtime at home because I wanted to show my students. This was like 100 years ago with an ancient Betamax video camera, with big things which sit in the corner and very, very clumsy, and the tripod has to kind of be cranked to move it, so you don't really get very much, but anyway. So I caught this incident of my daughter offering my husband an object, a really rather meaningless object, and then pulling it back. Actually, I will show that one to you. And then pulling it back. And she had just been able to give and release objects for about 2 weeks then. She was just 2 days under 9 months at that point. Okay, so at 8.5 months she'd been able to, because it's quite difficult not only to hold objects up but to actually let them go. But she'd been able to do it. Now she started mucking around with it. So what she was doing was she's offering it to him. Him being a man, he didn't get it, so he was fooled on camera. So he thought she was genuinely offering. And you can kind of see when you slow it down that there is a little bit of anticipation with what parents often describe as cheeky expressions prior to the offer. So she kind of offers it. They've been playing a give and take game now for about 2 minutes in this clip that I'm going to show you. And enjoying it. He asks and he says ta, and then she gives and she says ta, and blah, blah, blah. And then she decides to vary it. And there's a pause and she kind of wiggles it to get his attention. And you can see this sort of slight smile on her face. He reaches out and she pulls it back and grins. And then he gets the message and says, "Oh, you devil, give it to me." So she takes it back and then she tries it again. He says, "Ta." That's just a straight. She takes it. And now. So now he gets it, asks for it. Okay, so around 8 months, about half the sample were doing something that the parents reported as teasing, and offer withdrawal was not the only kind of teasing by any means. I mean, most of you, if you've had any kids, you will probably remember the very, very tiresome dropping something off the high chair for you to pick up, okay? Or touching plug sockets or fireplaces which you're not supposed to touch, and so on and so forth, right? So things that the child is doing deliberately to provoke reactions. And so it's kind of a variety of teasing that occurs within the first year. And again, this was kind of very different in the other children with autism as well. Okay, right, I'm going to kind of wind up. Let me end up with one study. What about intentional action? Okay, so most studies of looking at action understanding in infancy, again use infants as spectators. And again, this is a bit bizarre because even more vividly than attention, infants are being prodded and poked from the moment of birth, right? They're receiving, if you like, actions directed towards them from the start. So we know from these third-party studies that if you use a very generous measure of how do you know that somebody understands, how do you know that somebody even grasps what an action is directed towards, what the object of an intentional action is? You use a looking time measure. So you get infants habituated to one kind of grasping action, then you vary it with appropriate controls, and basically children, even 5-month-olds and 3-month-olds with training, look longer at the sudden change of object. Why is that disembodied arm grasping the ball now rather than the teddy bear and so on? So it's kind of really quite remarkable. If you use harder measures, not what they call offline measures, but online measures, like you actually use anticipation while the action is going on, then you don't really get any evidence of sensitivity until about 6 months to intentional action, right? So if you use eye tracking measures, for instance, infants can track, depending on the kind of action, from around 6 months is about the earliest. 8 months, you're going to get kind of more comfortable. It's harder because you're predicting an action while it's going on. But what about then, if you combine these two ideas, that actions directed to the self, the infant has experienced much more than actions directed towards the rest of the world. It's observing those two, but these are kind of more salient, surely. Combine that idea with the idea of actually looking at when somebody comes to direct an action towards you, what kinds of anticipations does the infant do? And does the infant do anything? And can you actually see whether this happens earlier than the other kinds of anticipated actions? Sorry. Okay, I'm going to kind of do this just verbally because it's kind of more interesting. So, how do we study this? Well, we've decided to focus on using being picked up as a measure. An infant's responses to being picked up. Okay, so you're going to be picked. You're picked up. You were picked up from the moment of birth, and I believe you don't hold babies by the heels anymore. So you don't kind of smack their bottoms. But I had said this in a talk the other day and said, no, we don't do that anymore. So you're experiencing being picked up from birth. At some point a long time, do you anticipate actions when people are coming towards you to pick you up, or familiar people, when you understand the gesture of arms outstretched? So this is kind of what we want to study for two reasons. One is because I remembered from when my own kids were young that somewhere around 4 months, right, you go to pick up a baby from the car seat, and so you grasp them here, and you can kind of feel their backs are already tense and arched, right? And that kind of, it's not because you've held them that, you know how you can feel in your fingertips the tension in muscles. It's very hard to measure. And this might be interesting, we thought, also. I mean, I always wanted to study it, but I didn't know how to kind of measure it. But this might be interesting, we thought, also because there's this statement from Kanner about parents of children with autism were reporting to him that they did not make postural adjustments to being picked up. Okay, so this was children rather than infants. So there could be something, if you like, interesting going on here, either to do with the awareness, the anticipation of intentional actions, or to do with planning your own response to it. I don't know the explanation, but there was something very interesting to do here with responding to intentional action, whatever was going on. We managed to find a way of measuring this because we found something called a sensor mat, which is basically a plastic sheet with pressure sensors in it, okay, which is plugged into a laptop, which gives you immediate display of head, back, upper back, and bottom over there. The legs were too long for it. Which actually allows you to measure the extent to which bodies are lifted up, or force changes, and so on and so forth. So to cut a long story short, we were aiming at trying to find how 4-month-olds did back arching in response to being picked up. We didn't really find clear evidence with the mat of back arching. It was there, but it was not so, it was a bit more messy than I'd hoped. But what we did find, and which surprised us, we did a study. We did two studies actually. We did one with 3-month-olds. We did sort of 18 kids at 3 months. So it was a kind of a cross-sectional study. And of those 18 kids, 10 of them had started at 2 months. So we followed them through to 4 months of age. And basically, what we found was that even by 2 months of age, kids were doing all sorts of anticipatory adjustments of their body to being picked up. So how do we know it, and what were they doing? Well, one way in which you can begin to answer this is to say, what would you do if you were in a demonstration, you were going to be arrested by the police and you didn't want to be arrested? Go on, tell me you're activists. What are you supposed to do? You don't want to be picked up by the policeman, so you go completely limp. My colleague, Alan Costel, came home from, he doesn't drive, so he came home from the shop, came to the university from the shops one day, and he says, he bought a bag of compost, yeah, for plants. And he says, it's exactly the opposite of your babies. It's impossible to lift because it is kind of limp. And I'm thinking, gosh, that's really interesting. Anyway, there's a whole host of thinking about what do you do with your body if you are preparing to adjust it for interaction. Not just for adjusting it for your own action on the world, but actually for being. So one of the things that you do is you don't go limp. You don't have kind of no shape. You have rigidity, right? You reduce, if you like, the degrees of floppiness, that you reduce the degrees of freedom in your body for bits to go everywhere. You keep it either rigid or you keep it tight. And as soon as that happens, like in yoga, you can pick up planks with one finger. I can't. Naomi probably can. So we were looking, we went about this in two ways. We looked first at what the babies did do, and then we focused only on those features, those adjustments, which increased, if you like, the rigidity of the body or enhanced the pickup in some sort of way. And basically we found 3 kinds of things that you could look at. One is the babies were doing something with their legs. So they were either lifting their legs slightly off the mat, extending them and making them rigid, or they were tucking them up into a ball, okay? As the arms approach. So we separated out mothers chatting from the arms approaching before they touch the baby, so on and so forth. Then they did something with their hands, which we totally didn't expect either, which is they were opening them up or making them go upwards, or even in some cases almost going up. I mean, this is 2 and 3 month olds. You're not supposed to, I mean, I never saw it, but it's on video, so you can't really challenge it. And then they did a third thing, which is harder to explain, but they sometimes, and different infants did different things. They turned their heads to the side. The only explanation I can have of that is that it increases the tension. It's called torque or something, if you're mechanically minded males. Sorry, that was a conversation reference to men and engineers and autumn. Sorry, that was earlier. Or they kind of lifted their chins up. If you lift your chin up, what you're also doing is arching your back. So there are 3 babies in this video clip. The first one, I want you to look at what he does with his chin as the arms are approaching. He doesn't do very much with his legs or with his arms, okay? This is played at normal speed, but I think it's okay, you get it. So he's excited, arms approach, chin goes up, and he stills, yeah? Okay, and then the mother picks him up. Next baby, this one. So what you're basically going to see is that all the thrashings reduces, the general excitement reduces as the mother gets closer, and the adjustments increase. This baby did a lot of, she's very strong, both with her head, neck, and with her legs. So she did this legs extended and made more rigid. And the mother actually delays a bit on this one, so she tries to hurry her up. Oops. Oops, sorry. Sorry. This one is a combination of head and arms, I think. Okay. And although the movements were much less fluent in 2-month-olds, we found the same patterns, the same spread of different kinds of adjustments even at 2 months. So this one, a bit clear. Okay, so for me, this puts a whole new light on the kinds of intentional engagements that are happening, right? You can interpret this in a number of different ways, and I think to say that infants understand other people's the directedness of other people's intentions, I would say that, but I think it is certainly a debatable issue in terms of what do we mean by intentions, what do we mean by directedness, or by object. But in the general sense of that I am the object of this particular intentional action, in where intentional action is equal to action, I don't think that is hugely controversial. But the key thing, I think, is what's happening here is that certainly from 2 months, probably from earlier than that, infants are getting drawn into intentional engagements within which, if you like, they have got experience of other people's intentions in more and more complex ways. So if you want to look at increasing understanding of what do other people's actions mean, not only their actions on my body, but their actions for me to do, somewhere towards the end of in the second half of the first year, here is the ground, the joint action ground from which that understanding can be built up. I am very conscious of time. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I'm going to... Okay, so if you really want to see, here is a 7-month-old being drawn in to joining intentions in a more complex way by the mother from far apart, tells him to kick the ball, and he kind of does it accidentally, doesn't get it, then does it accidentally, kind of then develops. The second time he does it more consciously and looks at the mother. So this is kind of catching, if you like. Oops. Oh, you can't hear it. Kick the ball, Jack, she says. And he doesn't, he's just bouncing around and it accidentally kicks the ball. And then she says, oh yeah. And then second time, she says kick the ball and he kind of does it. And so on. That's, okay. I was kind of I am getting interested in something to do with the unscriptedness of engagements, right? Which I think is what dialogue is about, is what emotional engagement is about, and which opens doors. So I really like this quote of Buber's where he says there's something about, having a conversation which is open on both sides, which is genuine. That's what dialogue is. It's this element of surprise, which is the mark of a genuine. Why is this interesting? Because for me, that is what engagement is about. You kind of don't know what you're getting into. It could go anywhere, right? Engagement isn't something that you script and you do in a particular way. There is genuinely uncertainty in it. Gadamer's idea of genuine conversation, he says, you talk about conducting a conversation, but we don't usually conduct conversations, we fall into them. And no one kind of knows in advance what will come out of a conversation. Okay. I'm going to end with, why am I talking about openness? Well, I'm interested in openness because this idea of engagement, if engagement requires some genuinely being in the present and relating to another person, there is something involved in it which is openness to others. Okay? The idea, openness to others in the moment, openness to the other in the moment. And I'm kind of been getting very interested in this and been also kind of trying to read, as I was telling you earlier, Buddhist ideas of what it means to be present, what it means to be in the moment. And there are some amazingly wonderful overlaps between these ideas of being in the present and psychology's rather fumbling attempts to understand openness to other people. Okay? I kind of see openness to engagement, openness to the other, as in fact being what humility is about. I think, or at least one aspect of it. Not humility in the sense of I am willing to admit that I'm wrong, which is definitely one aspect of humility, or taking lessons from that. But in the sense of, or at least one aspect of humility, is this ability to be open to the person in order for the ideas, in order for you to be open to the ideas. So this is the kind of stuff that I'm um, trying to make sense of aspects of humility, partly because there's this very famous paper in psychology about the emotional dog. I can't remember it exactly, but it's something about letting the rational tail wag the emotional dog, or it could be the other way around. It's about how psychology worships the intellectual so much that it tries to offer explanations of phenomena like engagement in intellectual terms. And maybe what we should really be looking at is emotional processes. And the way in which we might do it, one way in which we might get ahead on that, is understanding moments of meeting between people. I was also been thinking about what happens with engagements which are negative. So I love Naomi's example of the misaligned eye contact. But you can also have very, very aligned but negatively aligned eye contact, negatively aligned connection, moments of connection, which are also probably equally transformative, although in different directions. I had an example recently with an immigration officer in Frankfurt where he was kind of weird. I didn't know what was going on. He never said anything nasty to me. I have an Indian passport and have brown skin, and this combination is a little bit problematic sometimes. So he didn't say, and I had a visa, I had everything. He looked at it. He took everything. He took about 3 times as long as he should have done. Something weird was going on. Couldn't put my finger on it. And right at the end, but it was something unpleasant. He wasn't even looking at me. He was kind of looking over there. I was really like a fly in the. You kind of go there and you smile, and I don't know. I'm always scared with immigration, especially German ones. They're kind of really scary. But so right at the end, after he'd even stamped it, I thought, okay, fine, that's done. You can't really go back on it now. Right at the end, so he had this in him, but he didn't give it to me. So he held this passport, and he was looking at the queue. I was here, he was looking at the queue. What's going on? And then he picks it up, and then he bangs it on the desk. He doesn't slap it down, he slaps it like a whip, still holding it. And he looks at me, and then he puts it there. And it's like this kind of, so it was this really horrible mixture of, I wasn't alone, I wasn't traveling alone, so I could kind of, if you like, debrief that incident. But it stuck, So there are these kind of, so the power of transformation of these moments of connection, I think, are there frighteningly so from birth. And every time we meet a little girl and or a little boy, and we don't smile at them and be nice to them, or smile too much at them and make them feel horrible, we're doing something bad to them. So that's kind of a bit scary. But okay, I'm going to stop now.